According to the Corpus Hermeticum, if you still react automatically, you have not awakened. You are merely spiritually anesthetized. For the Corpus Hermeticum, spiritual awakening begins the moment you stop confusing yourself with thoughts, emotions, and impulses that arise on their own. The Corpus Hermeticum is blunt. While passions govern you, there is no awakening, only sleep disguised as a spiritual quest. According to the Corpus Hermeticum, seeking awakening without abandoning identification with the body and the mind is nothing more than continuing to sleep using sacred language. Hermetic spiritual awakening begins the instant the false self loses its authority, but everything before that is well-decorated illusion. You want to awaken, yet you continue sleeping with your eyes open. You say you seek truth, but you wake up every day obeying the same impulses, the same fears, the same distractions. This is not awakening. This is repeating the same day in a different outfit. Awakening begins with the direct recognition that you live identified with something that is not you, and as long as this identification persists, there is no awakening at all, only spiritual fantasy. In the Corpus Hermeticum, when Gnosis is spoken of, it is not belief that is meant. Gnosis is direct, lived knowledge, born when the intellect stops lying to itself. The text is clear in stating that the human being lives asleep because he confuses the intellect with the soul and the soul with the body. You wake up thinking you are your thoughts, you react believing that this is you. This is exactly the state Hermes describes as ignorance. Not a lack of information, but an inability to perceive one's own inner condition. So stay with me, because now the teaching ceases to be comfortable entirely. Hermeticism was never meant to soothe those who sleep. It was made to awaken those who are already tired of lying to themselves. When the texts say that man has forgotten his origin, this is not an ancient myth. It is exactly what happens to you when you wake up and lose yourself in thought before even feeling your own body. This forgetting is the true sin in the Hermetic sense, not moral, but existential. In the Poimandres, the description of the soul descending and mingling with the forces of nature reveals something brutal. You come to love what binds you. You cling to anger as identity, to fear as protection, to anxiety as if it were attention. And then you ask why you suffer. The text is merciless. As long as man loves the mixture, he does not want liberation. Awakening begins when you feel disgust toward your own automatism, when you grow weary of repeating the same inner states and calling them me. The term forgetting appears implicitly in many treatises because the opposite of gnosis is not intellectual ignorance, and it is the absence of presence. You forget yourself dozens of times an hour, and each forgetting reinforces the prison. The teaching almost no one speaks of is this: awakening does not require heroic effort, it requires continuous remembrance. Remembering yourself while speaking, while walking, while reacting. It sounds simple. It is unbearably difficult because the ego hates being seen. When the Corpus Hermeticum says that the regenerated human becomes a son of God, this does not mean spiritual status. It means he ceases to move like a reactive animal and begins to act from the Nous. And this hurts because the Nous does not negotiate with your excuses. It exposes, it shows you that you react because you are not present, that you flee because you do not want to see, that you distract yourself because silence threatens you. The Kybalion, when it speaks of the principle of vibration, points to something you feel in your body every day. When you are present, everything slows down. When you sleep, everything accelerates. Anxiety is disordered vibration. Presence is stability. This is not positive thinking, it is an inner axis. And that axis is born only when you stop moving along with every emotion that arises. Each time you observe without reacting, you rise a degree. Each time you get lost, you descend. There is no judgment in this, there is fact. The law of rhythm explains why you have days of clarity and days of total confusion. The inner pendulum keeps swinging until you create a fixed point of consciousness. The real Hermetic secret is this fixed point. It is not a mantra. It is not visualization. It is attention, naked attention, without story, without justification. Sustaining this is the work, and almost no one sustains it because it requires dying to drama. Hermetic Kabbalah describes the fall as fragmentation. You feel this when you want one thing and do another, when you know something and act against it. This inner division is the sign of sleep. Unification does not happen through belief, it happens through seeing yourself divided without fleeing. The moment you perceive the division and do not try to fix it is the moment something begins to align. This is the return to unity in real time. Now listen to this with your body, not just your mind. Hermeticism never promised that you would feel better, it promised that you would become more conscious, and consciousness burns illusions. It exposes attachment, spiritual vanity, the search for an elevated identity. That is why the path is solitary, not because you isolate yourself, but because no one can look for you. Do you want something truly secret? Here it is, there is no awakening without conscious discomfort. If you are comfortable all the time, you are asleep. Awakening begins when you sustain attention exactly at the point where you would normally flee, in boredom, in anger, in emptiness. This is the alchemical laboratory, this is the furnace, not the symbol, not the ritual, not the discourse. Hermes makes it clear that liberation happens while you are alive, not afterward. This means that every ordinary instant is the battlefield. There is no neutral moment. Either you are present or you are forgotten. Either you see or you are carried away. This is the cut. This is the Hermetic blade. And now there is no escape. How many times today did you remember yourself without effort? In which emotions do you always get lost? What exactly are you protecting when you avoid inner silence? And if true awakening is not a future revelation, but the brutal decision not to get lost in the next instant, are you willing to sustain that? Or would you still rather sleep a little longer? So pay attention now, because what follows is not empty symbolism nor display window spirituality. It is the raw core of the Hermetic teaching as it truly is. In Corpus Hermeticum I, Poimandres, when the divine intellect reveals itself to Hermes, it declares something devastating. The human being is double, mortal by the body, immortal by essence. This is not poetry. It is a map of your daily experience. You live as if you were only body, story, memory, emotion. Awakening begins when you perceive, not as an idea but as a lived fact, that there is something in you that observes this mixture without being confused with it. Until this is directly experienced, you remain in the state Hermes calls ignorance. Poimandres describes the soul's descent into the world as an enchantment. This word is crucial. Enchantment means being hypnotized by one's own sensory and mental experience. You are not wrong, you are enchanted. Trapped in narrative, reaction, impulse, the secret almost no one speaks of is that enchantment is not broken by force, but by continuous lucidity. Each time you notice I am reacting, the spell weakens. Each time you justify yourself, it strengthens. In Corpus Hermeticum 7, Hermes states that the supreme good of the human being is the knowledge of God, and that all evil is born from ignorance of this knowledge. But God in Hermeticism is not an external figure. God is the principle of unity, of the one. To know God is to recognize the one within yourself. This is unbearable to the ego because it means abandoning the fantasy of being a separate center. That is why the text says few attain it, not out of elitism, but because few accept to die inwardly. Now listen carefully to this point. Hermeticism does not teach how to improve the ego, it teaches how to shift the center of identity. When the text speaks of abandoning passions, it is not talking about moral repression. Passion in the ancient sense is everything that happens to you without your choosing it. Anger that explodes, fear that paralyzes, desire that drags you along. As long as you are possessed by these, you do not act, you are acted upon. Hermes calls this servitude. In Corpus Hermeticum the 15, regeneration is described as a process in which the disciple enumerates inner forces that must be dissolved: ignorance, sorrow, intemperance, concupiscence, injustice, greed, falsehood. This is not a moral list. These are states of consciousness. Each one arises when you lose presence. When you are present, they do not dominate. When you sleep, they take control. The practice is one, lucid presence repeated until it becomes stable. Here enters a term that is almost never explained correctly: logos. In Hermeticism, logos is not beautiful speech. Logos is intelligible order. When you are present, your action aligns with the logos. When you react, you act against order. That is why your life feels chaotic. Not because the world is chaotic, but because you live outside the inner axis. Awakening is realigning with the logos through consciousness. The Kybalion, when speaking of the principle of cause and effect, is not teaching fatalistic determinism. It is exposing something brutal. While you are not conscious, you are effect. When you are conscious, you begin to be cause. This is not abstract metaphysics. It is observable. Look at your life. See how many decisions you make from clarity and how many from impulse. Awakening begins when you realize that almost everything in you happens on its own. The law of gender, another distorted principle, does not speak of physical sex, but of the active and receptive polarities of consciousness. The modern error is trying to be always active, always asserting, always forcing. Hermes points out that true gnosis is born when the mind becomes receptive, silent, capable of listening. Listening to what? To reality, without filter. As long as your mind speaks non-stop, no revelation is possible. Now comes a very rare teaching, yet faithful to the texts. Hermeticism does not seek altered experiences, it seeks stability of consciousness. Visions pass, ecstasies pass. What matters is this: do you remain conscious when nothing special is happening? If not, you still depend on stimulation to feel something. That is sleep disguised as spirituality. Hermetic Kabbalah confirms this when it describes the fall into dense worlds as a progressive loss of consciousness, and the ascent as a progressive return to unity. But this ascent does not happen outside of life. It happens while you speak, work, get frustrated, wait. Each instant is a test. Each instant reveals where you are still bound. And now comes the most uncomfortable truth of all. Hermetic awakening does not make you better than anyone else. It makes you less deluded, less reactive, less noisy inside. This impresses no one. It grants no stage, it gives no identity. That is why almost no one sustains it. The ego prefers an imaginary awakening to silent lucidity. Hermes never promised future salvation. He pointed to present liberation. Here, now, in this exact moment as you read or hear this. If you are present, there is light. If you are lost in thought, there is darkness. Simple, implacable, real. And now comes the question that does not let you escape. If the nous is the key, why do you spend your entire day identified with thoughts you never chose to think? What exactly prevents you in this instant from simply observing? And what if the next level of awakening is not learning something new, but sustaining consciousness for longer than you have ever sustained it before? What in you trembles before that possibility? Do you want real Hermetic terms? Then listen closely, because now, there is no comfortable poetry. There is structure, shock, and living practice. In Corpus Hermeticum, first known as Poimandres, Hermes Trismegistus describes the state of the ordinary human being as someone who loves the body, and therefore remains trapped in the confused mixture of sensation, desire, and thought. This is not a pretty metaphor, it is a diagnosis. To love the body here means to live identified with impulses, emotions, and inner narratives as if they were your essence. That is sleep. Poimandres presents the Nous as the divine principle within the human being. Nous is not reasoning, not opinion, not belief. In the text, Nous is that which sees. When the text says that the Nous is of the same nature as God, it is saying something devastating. You do not need to create something new in order to awaken. You need to stop identifying with what does not see. As long as you confuse thought with consciousness, you remain blind. This is stated directly in the Corpus Hermeticum. It is not a modern interpretation. Another central term that almost no one explains correctly is gnosis. In Hermeticism, gnosis is not the accumulation of sacred information. It is inner recognition. In Corpus Hermeticum the Thines, when palingenesia, regeneration is spoken of, the text describes a process of psychological death, abandoning passions, illusions, ignorance, and inner disorder. This does not happen by reading. It happens when you observe in real time the arising of passion and you do not move with it. That instant is living regeneration. Do you want something truly seldom spoken of? Then hear this. The Corpus Hermeticum makes it clear that the greatest enemy of awakening is fantasia, uncontrolled imagination, mental fantasy, inner images, stories about yourself. Today they call this visualization, manifestation, but Hermes treats it as a prison. The more you live in fantasy, the less present you are. Awakening requires inner sobriety, not imaginative ecstasy. This destroys 90% of modern spiritualism. In the Kybalion, when the principle of polarity is discussed, the text is not saying you should choose the positive. It points out that opposites are degrees of the same thing. This is practical and brutal. Anger and calm belong to the same axis. Fear and courage as well. The Hermetic work is not to repress one pole, but to raise the degree of consciousness over it. When you notice the emotion arising and you do not identify, you change degree. That is real inner alchemy. The law of rhythm, another principle that is badly interpreted, states that everything moves in cycles. Hermes already warned that whoever does not create a stable point of consciousness is dragged by the emotional pendulum. Today you are awake. Tomorrow you are lost. The secret that almost no one applies is to create a constant witness. It is not to control the rhythm, it is to not be carried by it. This demands daily vigilance, not motivation. In Hermetic Kabbalah, when the fall of consciousness into dense worlds is spoken of, this corresponds exactly to what the Corpus Hermeticum calls the soul's descent into the material mixture. It is not punishment, it is forgetting. The return does not happen by climbing symbols, but by reducing identification. Each time you remember yourself in the middle of action, you rise a degree. Each time you lose yourself in reaction, you fall. Simple, implacable. Now comes a very rare point. Hermes never promised happiness. He promised freedom from ignorance. And freedom here means not being dragged. It means being able to feel without being possessed, to think without being dominated, to act without being automatic. This is Hermetic awakening. Silent, invisible, unfriendly to the ego. Do you want real practice? Then here it is, bare and raw, faithful to the texts. Observe your thoughts as things that arise and pass. Observe your emotions as movements of inner nature. Do not fight, do not feed, do not flee. Sustain attention. That is nous in action. That is gnosis being born. Everything else is ornament. And now, face this without escape. If Hermes says ignorance is the greatest evil, where exactly do you continue ignoring yourself in daily life? In which moments do you vanish into impulse? What in you resists when you realize that true awakening is not to ascend but to disidentify? And what if the next veil to fall is not mystical, but the most painful of all? The image you have made of yourself. You keep looking for something secret, hidden, forbidden, as if awakening were outside you, locked inside an ancient vault. This is the oldest trap that Hermeticism exposes without mercy. The texts of the Corpus Hermeticum are clear in pointing out that the greatest veil is not in the world, it is in your constant identification with what passes. The secret was never external information, but the fact that you do not remain conscious long enough for truth to reveal itself on its own. This destroys the spiritual ego. That is why almost no one accepts it. There is something rarely said. Hermeticism does not begin when you study. It begins when you become unbearable to yourself, when you realize you live divided, fragmented, pulled by contradictory impulses. The ancient texts speak of the human being as one who partakes of the divine and the animal at the same time. The secret is that you do not need to kill the animal. You need to stop being ruled by it. This only happens when you observe in real time the impulse arising before you act. That instant is alchemical gold. Almost no one sustains it. When the Corpus Hermeticum describes regeneration, it does not speak of a sudden mystical event. It speaks of a process of emptying. You lose certainties, you lose identity, you lose the narrative you tell about yourself. And this produces fear, confusion, a sense of emptiness. Here is the point no one mentions. This emptiness is not a failure on the path. It is the sign that you have stopped filling yourself with automatic lies. Most people flee precisely here because the ego prefers familiar pain to unfamiliar silence. Another very rare teaching is this. The mind is not the enemy, but it is not the guide either. Hermeticism clearly distinguishes the ordinary intellect from the Nous. The ordinary intellect compares, judges, justifies. The Nous perceives without effort. When you try to think awakening, you move away from it. When you observe without inner commentary, something shifts axis. This is real practice. Daily, in the middle of ordinary life. Not in retreat, not in theory. In conflict, in boredom, in frustration. The law of vibration, so badly understood today, never spoke of positive thinking. It points out that inner states have different densities. Reactivity is dense, attention is subtle. The more you react, the heavier everything feels. The more you observe, the more space appears. The practical secret is simple and brutal. Whenever something affects you emotionally, there is the portal. Do not flee. Do not overanalyze. Feel and observe at the same time. This breaks automatism. This is living Hermeticism. Hermetic Kabbalah teaches that to ascend is not to accumulate light, but to reduce noise. Each higher level of perception requires less identification. That is why the path is described as narrow. Not because it is elitist, but because almost no one agrees to lose their excuses, their dramas, their personal stories. You call this who you are, but Hermes calls it forgetting. The return to the one begins when you stop defending yourself all the time. Here is another point almost no one mentions. Awakening does not make you more special. It makes you more ordinary, simpler, quieter inside. The ego wants extraordinary experiences. Hermeticism points to an ordinary lucidity. Eating consciously, walking consciously, being silent consciously. This is devastating to the spiritual character, which is why it does not sell promises, but it truly liberates. You want techniques. Hermeticism gives one, repeated 1,000 ways. Remembering yourself. Remembering that you are here while you live. Losing that is sleep. Regaining that is waking. There is no ritual that replaces this. There is no symbol that does this for you. Hermetic symbols only serve to remind you of what you insist on forgetting. Now face this without running. How many times today were you wholly present in what you were doing? How many times did you notice your own reaction before acting? What in you trembles when you realize that awakening is not gaining something, but losing the identity you protect so fiercely? And what if the true Hermetic secret is to see that the veil exists only as long as you refuse to look directly? So now you enter territory that almost no one has the courage to touch, because here, Hermeticism ceases to be study and becomes direct confrontation with what you avoid feeling. In the Hermetic treatises, there is a silent point rarely discussed, yet absolutely central. Awakening happens when a human being realizes that he lives possessed, not possessed by external entities, but by inner states that take command without asking permission. Poimandres describes the ordinary human as governed by the lower powers of nature. In practical terms, this means you live being pushed by desire, fear, aversion, and the pursuit of pleasure, as if this were your own will. And you call this me. Here is a very rare teaching, yet textual. The Nous does not descend while the soul is full of opinions, certainties, narratives, complaints, decorative spirituality. In the Corpus Hermeticum, regeneration requires emptying. And emptying hurts because it dismantles your identity. You feel confusion, emptiness, strangeness. And then you flee. The secret is that this emptiness is not a loss of meaning. It is the collapse of the false structure. Whoever cannot endure emptiness never touches the Nous. Another point almost never explained is the Hermetic distinction between animated life and conscious life. Everyone is biologically alive, very few are consciously alive. Hermes makes it clear that to live according to the body is to live in dispersion, to live according to the Nous is to live in unity. This does not happen when you think spirituality. It happens when you realize with an inner shock that you spend hours without remembering that you exist. This shock is the real beginning. In Corpus Hermeticum the Scenes, Hermes says that the greatest deception of humanity is confusing sensation with knowledge. This is devastating for the modern seeker. You confuse intense emotion with truth. You confuse a shiver with awakening. You confuse momentary peace with liberation. Hermeticism is cold on this point. Sensation passes, knowledge transforms. And true knowledge is born only when you see, without filter, how your mind operates automatically. This is unbearable for the ego. That is why it is rare. Now comes a teaching that is secret in the real sense of the word. Awakening does not begin at the top, it begins at the bottom. Hermes states that whoever does not know what is inferior cannot know what is superior. Translated into your life. As long as you do not observe your envy, your vanity, your need for recognition, your flight from silence, you are playing at spirituality. The work begins exactly where you feel ashamed to look. This is the alchemical underworld. This is real Negreda, not symbolic. The Kybalion touches this obliquely when it speaks of the principle of correspondence. Your inner chaos corresponds to the chaos of your life. Your repeated cycles correspond to your repeated unconsciousness. The practical secret is brutal. Observe the pattern that repeats most in your life. There lies the exact point where you sleep. It is not bad luck. It is not destiny. It is absence of presence. In Hermetic Kabbalah, this appears as the breaking of the vessels. Light cannot be sustained by fragile inner structures. In simple language, you cannot sustain consciousness because your psychological structure is fragile, dispersed, reactive. The work is not to receive more light, it is to strengthen the vessel. And the vessel is strengthened by constant attention, not by ecstasy. Now hear this with your gut, not your head. Hermeticism never promised that you would feel safe. It promises that you will become lucid. And lucidity removes the ground beneath your feet. You realize that almost everything in you is a habit, that your opinions are not yours, that your reactions are predictable, that your identity is a collection of reflexes. This moment is what the texts call symbolic death, not because you die physically, but because the lie dies. Another very rare teaching. Silence is the true Hermetic temple, not outer silence, but inner silence. The Corpus Hermeticum makes it clear that the Nous speaks when noise ceases. As long as your mind comments on everything, no revelation is possible, and the cruel truth is that you flee silence because in it you cease to exist as a character. The ego prefers noise to truth. Hermes never taught complex techniques because he knew the mind would turn them into escape. He taught observation, sobriety, attention. This is simple, and precisely for that reason it is almost impossible for those who live identified with constant stimulation. Hermetic awakening is learning to stay where you always ran from, to stay in discomfort without drama, to stay in emotion without getting lost, to stay in emptiness without filling it. And here is the final cut of this section. Without anesthesia. As long as you wait for something to happen in order to awaken, you are sleeping. As long as you wait to understand everything, you are sleeping. As long as you seek external confirmation, you are sleeping. Awakening happens in the instant you realize that you are sleeping, and do nothing except observe this with lucidity. Now feel this, and answer inwardly without lying. Which part of you feels threatened when you realize there is nothing to attain, only something not to forget? What in you resists when you see that the true Hermetic secret is not light, power, or ascension, but remaining conscious in the next ordinary instant? And if the next veil to fall is exactly your need for something special, are you ready to sustain that loss? Or do you still need one more illusion in order to keep seeking? Now you enter the point that almost no one crosses, because here Hermeticism ceases to be teaching and becomes a direct accusation against your inner state. In the Hermetic treatises, there is a harsh assertion repeated in different forms. The human being lives in continuous self-forgetting. This is not ordinary distraction. It is a structural condition. You do not merely get distracted, you disappear. And while you disappear, something mechanical takes command. This is what the Corpus Hermeticum calls life without nous. There is a term that is very rarely explained correctly, agnosia. It is not simple ignorance. It is the inability to recognize the real, even when it is right in front of you. You read, you listen, you agree, you feel moved, and you continue sleeping. Why? because recognition requires continuous presence, not passing emotional impact. The Hermetic text makes it clear that hearing the truth without becoming conscious of it is worse than never having heard it at all, because now you live under the illusion of knowing. Here is a secret almost no one has the courage to speak. Awakening begins when you realize that you decide almost nothing. Observe your day. Observe how thoughts arise uninvited. Emotions seize the body without warning. Words leave the mouth before consciousness arrives. This is not freedom. This is automatism. The Corpus Hermeticum states that the ignorant human is a slave to necessity. Necessity here is not material poverty. It is inner compulsion. You react because you are not there to act. When Hermes speaks of regeneration, he describes something the ego hates to hear. You must pass through a period of conscious disorientation, not knowing who you are, not trusting your own reactions, not leaning on old spiritual certainties. This state is described as symbolic death. And here is the point no one mentions. If you do not pass through inner confusion, you are not regenerating. You are merely reorganizing the same character with new ideas. Another teaching almost erased by modern readings. Hermeticism does not seek expansion of consciousness. It seeks centralization of consciousness. You are already expanded too much, scattered across 1,000 thoughts, desires, fears, stimuli. The work is to gather, to bring everything back to one point. That point is present attention. Without this, any elevated experience is just more dispersion disguised as light. The Kybalion, when it speaks of the principle of cause and effect, exposes something emotionally cruel. While you are not conscious, you do not live, you are lived. Your personal story is not a sequence of free choices. It is a chain of unconscious reactions. And this hurts to admit, because it destroys the image of control you created in order to survive. But exactly there, the first real spark of awakening is born, seeing yourself as effect without justification. The law of rhythm reveals another practical secret. Every seeker passes through cycles of clarity and decline. The fatal error is to romanticize clarity and identify with the fall. Hermeticism teaches something harsher. Observe both with the same lucidity. When you identify with the good state, you have already begun to fall. When you observe the fall without drama, you have already begun to rise. This is not theory, this is invisible daily practice. Now comes a point rarely stated directly. Hermeticism does not want you to believe in anything. Belief is seen as a subtle form of ignorance. Belief allows you to sleep thinking you have already arrived. Gnosis demands seeing. Seeing hurts, because seeing dismantles narratives, dismantles identity, dismantles childish spiritual hope. But only what is dismantled can be regenerated. In Hermetic Kabbalah, this appears as the need to cross the inner abyss, not as a mystical place, but as the collapse of psychological reference points. You no longer know what to lean on. You do not trust thought. You do not trust emotion. This emptiness is frightening. And here's the secret. If you flee the emptiness, you return to prison. If you remain conscious in the emptiness, something new begins to organize itself on its own. Another very rare teaching. Awakening is not cumulative. It is momentary and repeated. You do not accumulate consciousness as merit. You lose it and recover it constantly. The work is not never falling. It is falling less deeply and rising more quickly. The Corpus Hermeticum implies this when it states that the regenerated human remains vigilant. Vigilance is not tension, it is living remembrance. Now feel this in your chest. Hermeticism never promised meaning for life. It promised truth about life. And the truth is that you spend much of your time absent. And while you are absent, you suffer, react, become confused, and call this destiny. Awakening begins when you accept this without hating yourself, without justifying yourself, without distracting yourself, simply seeing. And here's the final blow of this layer. While you search for something deeper, you may be fleeing the most obvious fact, that you are not present now. And if the most secret teaching of all were this, nothing changes until you remain conscious in the next instant where you would normally disappear. Are you willing to sustain this naked vigilance? Or do you still need more words to postpone the direct confrontation with yourself? Now listen with your whole body, because here the teaching ceases to be explanation and becomes exposure of your real state. There is something in the Hermetic text that is almost never said aloud. The human being prefers the familiar prison to unknown freedom, not out of malice, out of fear. The Corpus Hermeticum implies this when it states that the human loves what makes him suffer because it gives him identity. You suffer, but at least you know who you are, and awakening requires losing that reference. That is why you hesitate. That is why you retreat. That is why you seek more words, instead of sustaining the vision. There is a very rare point, almost always ignored. Self-forgetting is not an accident. It is an addiction. You do not fall into automatism by chance. There is pleasure in disappearing. There is relief in not being present. Being conscious demands inner responsibility. It demands feeling without anesthesia. It demands seeing your contradictions without makeup. Hermeticism never romanticized this, it exposed it. And you feel this when you try to stay present and something in you immediately seeks distraction. That impulse is the jailer. Another little spoken teaching. The mind creates urgency to avoid presence. Observe. Whenever you begin to become conscious, a rush appears, something to fix, something to think about, something to improve. This is not productivity. It is flight. The Corpus Hermeticum speaks of the human who lives dispersed among multiple forces. Today you call this modern life. Hermes calls it slavery. And as long as you do not perceive this at the exact moment it happens, you will continue calling prison normality. Now comes a brutally true point. Awakening does not begin when you see the light. It begins when you see the lie. The lie that you choose everything. The lie that your personality is fixed. The lie that your thoughts are your allies. When you realize, without philosophy, that most of your day happens without you, something breaks inside. This shock is not pleasant. It is the real beginning. In the Hermetic text, the word regeneration carries a weight few accept. It implies destruction of the old way of existing. Not improvement, not updating. Destruction, you do not evolve as a character. The character loses authority. And this generates grief. Yes, grief, because you lose the version of yourself you defended, justified, explained everything through. And here is the emotional secret no one speaks of. Many abandon the path because they cannot endure the grief of the ego. Another rare teaching, inner silence is not peace at first. It is conscious tension. You try to become silent and feel discomfort, restlessness, almost panic. This happens because noise sustained your identity. Without noise, you do not know who you are. Hermeticism does not tell you to flee this. It tells you to stay until the false center collapses. To stay until something deeper takes over. Those who do not stay return to spiritualized noise. There is still something almost no one says clearly. Real awakening makes your outer life simpler and your inner life more demanding. You lose interest in drama, but you gain inner responsibility. There is no longer any excuse to react without seeing, no excuse to hide behind concepts. And this weighs heavily, because now you know, and knowing without acting is worse than not knowing. Hermeticism also points out silently that time is the great test. Not chronological time, but the capacity to sustain presence longer than before. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 1 minute. Awakening does not come as an explosion. It comes as duration. And each additional second of consciousness hurts because it reveals how often you normally disappear. But exactly their real freedom is born. Now feel this honestly, you seek secret teachings because deep down you hope for something that spares you this naked work. Something that elevates you without stripping you, something that transforms you without confronting you. And Hermeticism cuts this hope at the root. It says there is no substitute for being here, no symbol, no law, no ancient name. And here is perhaps the rarest and hardest teaching to accept. Awakening is not continuous because you do not want it to be. There are parts of you that survive on sleep, on complaint, on wounded identity, on spiritual narrative. Seeing this hurts more than any ignorance, but while you do not see it, nothing changes. Now let this question echo without answering quickly, without protecting yourself. What exactly in you loses power when you are present? What in you dies when you do not get lost in thought? And if the true Hermetic secret is not learning anything more but remaining conscious in the next instant where you would normally flee, are you willing to sustain this loss? Or do you still prefer more words to keep postponing the moment you truly appear? Now you reach the point where Hermeticism ceases to be knowledge and becomes a living test of what you are capable or incapable of sustaining. There is an extremely rare teaching in the Hermetic texts that almost no one faces directly. The greatest obstacle is not ignorance, but the refusal to remain conscious when the truth begins to hurt. The Corpus Hermeticum shows, indirectly yet consistently, that the human being does not flee from evil but from the real, because the real dismantles the inner theater in which you feel like someone. There is a fundamental Hermetic distinction that is almost never explained. Attention is not concentration. Concentration is mental tension. Attention is effortless presence. The Nous does not appear when you force the mind. It appears when you stop pushing thoughts and begin to see. This is a technical and emotional secret at the same time. The more you try to do awakening, the more you push it away. And this humiliates the spiritual ego because it wants merit, not lucid surrender. Another very rare teaching. True awakening begins when you lose the right to complain. Not because complaining is forbidden, but because when you see the mechanism functioning, complaining becomes a lie. You realize that your reaction is born from absence of presence, and then something breaks inside. You can no longer pretend it was the other, the world, the situation. Hermes calls this leaving servitude, and leaving servitude hurts because it strips you of your excuses. In ancient Hermeticism, there is a harsh understanding of will, Ordinary will is not free. It is the result of impulses, habits, fears. What you today call a decision is most of the time delayed reaction. Awakening begins when you see this without justifying yourself. And when you see it, something different is born, a silent will which does not shout, does not prove anything, does not assert itself. It simply acts when you are present. This is Logos embodied in everyday life. Here enters a teaching almost never spoken aloud. Suffering does not awaken anyone automatically. Suffering awakens only when it is seen consciously. Otherwise, it merely hardens the ego. The Corpus Hermeticum makes it clear that unpurified passions generate more ignorance. Translated into your life, suffering without consciousness does not bring you closer to truth. It only makes you tired. What transforms is suffering without fleeing, seeing the entire mechanism while it unfolds. There is also something rarely said about inner time. Hermeticism points out that the human being lives projected into the future or trapped in the past, and therefore is never here. The secret is not living in the now as a slogan. The secret is perceiving the constant impulse to leave the now. That impulse is the prison. Each time you see it and do not follow it, you break a link. Small, invisible, but real. Awakening is made of these silent cuts. Another brutally honest point. Hermeticism does not want you to feel enlightened. It wants you to be lucid when there is no sensation at all. The proof of awakening is not ecstasy, it is sobriety. It is being present when nothing happens, when the day is ordinary, when no one sees, when there is no emotional reward. This is the gold almost no one wants because it does not feed identity. In the Hermetic text, regeneration is described as a return to simplicity. And this offends the modern seeker who wants complexity, symbols, maps, levels. Hermes points to something almost insulting in its simplicity, seeing what is happening while it is happening, and you fail at this dozens of times per hour. Not because of incapacity, but because of unconscious refusal, because seeing requires dying a little at every instant. Now comes a teaching almost no one can tolerate hearing. Awakening is not cumulative because the ego tries to appropriate it. Each time you think, now I know, you have fallen. Each time you feel more conscious than before, you are asleep. Hermeticism teaches vigilance without conclusion, a path without arrival, lucidity without identity. This crushes spiritual vanity, which is why it is avoided. There is also something deeply emotional and rarely admitted. There are parts of you that do not want to awaken. They survive on repetition, on drama, on self-image, even on pain. Seeing this without hating yourself is one of the hardest trials, because you realize you are not one single thing. And unity is not born by denying division, but by seeing it completely. This seeing is the beginning of real integration. And here the teaching becomes a merciless mirror. While you seek something deeper, you may be fleeing the most demanding thing of all, remaining conscious when nothing in you wants to remain. Not when you are inspired, not when you are motivated, but when you are tired, irritated, empty. That is where Hermeticism watches you. That is where the work truly begins. Now let this pass through you without answering quickly. In which moments do you always disappear? What in you loses power when you are present? And if the true secret teaching is not another ancient revelation, but the brutal decision not to get lost in the next impulse, are you willing to sustain this presence? Or do you still prefer to seek something higher to avoid the exact point where everything is decided? Now you enter the level that almost no one crosses, because here Hermeticism reveals something that strikes directly at the nerve of your identity. The greatest attachment of the human being is not to pleasure but to reaction itself. You are attached to the way you react to things. You recognize yourself through the anger you feel, the sadness you repeat, the anxiety that has already become home. And when this begins to be seen with lucidity, a deep fear arises because without reaction you no longer know who you are. The Corpus Hermeticum points to this when it shows that the human being confuses himself with the powers that pass through him. You do not perceive the forces, you become the force. This is sleep. There is an extremely rare teaching, absolutely faithful to the Hermetic spirit. Awakening does not happen when you feel present, but when you perceive the exact instant in which you become absent. That second is the portal, not the beautiful state afterward. The moment of the fall. The moment when the mind pulls, the emotion dominates, the body reacts. If you see that instant and do not follow it, something breaks. Small, invisible, but real. This is practical alchemy. Everything else is decoration. Another point almost no one speaks of because it destroys performative spirituality. Hermeticism does not work with hope. Hope projects. It projects forward to later, to when I am better. Hermes cuts this off. The work is now or it is not. And this hurts because you realize that you are always postponing being here, always waiting for an ideal condition, and that condition never comes. Awakening begins when you accept that there will be no perfect scenario in which to wake up. There is a silent teaching in the text that few grasp. Consciousness grows by subtraction, not by addition. You do not add light, you lose noise, you lose compulsion, you lose the need to explain yourself, you lose the urge to convince. This is deeply uncomfortable for the ego because it survives on accumulation. More knowledge, more identity, more certainty. Hermeticism does the opposite. It takes away. And each thing that falls hurts like a small death. There is also something almost no one admits. The body is the first field of awakening, not as exercise but as signal. Observe your body when you are asleep inside. Tension, haste, shallow breathing. Observe when you are present. Weight, ground, silence. The Corpus Hermeticum points out that the soul mixes with the body and gets lost. The return begins when you feel the body without getting lost in it. This is subtle, this is difficult, this is real. Another very rare teaching. Thought does not need to be fought, it needs to be seen as an event. While you try to silence it by force, you are fighting the shadow. When you observe thought arising and passing without following it, you change axis. And here comes the emotional shock. You realize that almost no thought deserves your energy, and yet you spend your entire life obeying all of them. Seeing this generates shame, anger, sadness. All of this is part of real purification. Hermeticism implies something devastating. Most people do not fail due to lack of capacity, but due to lack of honesty with themselves. You know when you are asleep. You feel when you get lost. But you prefer to justify it. To call it tiredness, a phase, a process. Hermes calls this self-deception. And there is no gnosis possible while self-deception is protected. There is also a teaching almost forbidden in its directness. Awakening does not make you more spiritual. It makes you more responsible. Responsible for every reaction you do not see. Responsible for every word that leaves your mouth without consciousness. Responsible for every silent escape. This weighs heavily. And many retreat exactly here because the ego prefers the fantasy of light to the responsibility of lucidity. Another very rare point, continuous presence is unnatural for the personality. It will resist. It will create boredom, discomfort, drowsiness, doubt, anything to make you leave. Knowing this changes everything. Because when resistance arises, you stop thinking you are failing. You understand that you are touching the right point. The alchemical furnace heats up precisely when the metal begins to change. And here comes the deepest cut. There is no awakening without passing through the sensation of absolute emptiness. Emptiness of identity. Emptiness of narrative. Emptiness of manufactured meaning. This emptiness is not depression, it is space without filling. And you were trained to fill everything. To remain there conscious without moving is an act of silent courage. Few do it. That is why few awaken. Hermeticism never promised belonging. It promised truth. And the initial truth is harsh. You live a large part of your life absent. And while you are absent, any teaching becomes ornament. Awakening begins when you accept this without punishing yourself and without fleeing. Simply staying, simply seeing, simply not getting lost in the next second. Now let this pass through you without answering quickly. At what point do you always flee when you begin to become conscious? What exactly do you lose when you do not identify with reaction? And if the most secret teaching of all is neither ancient nor hidden, but simply remaining present when everything in you begs to escape, are you willing to sustain this naked presence? Or do you still need more layers to avoid the instant in which you truly appear? Now you enter the most cruel and most truthful point of Hermeticism, the one almost no one verbalizes because it dismantles the seeker's last refuge. The human being does not fear ignorance, he fears continuous lucidity. Ignorance hurts less than seeing without pause. The Corpus Hermeticum makes this clear when it shows that the soul, upon recognizing its condition, first feels disturbance, not peace. You do not wake up smiling. You wake up disoriented, exposed, without ground. And it is exactly here that almost everyone retreats. There is a very rare teaching, yet absolutely consistent with the texts. Awakening begins when you realize that you cannot remain awake. It sounds paradoxical, but it is the precise strike. As long as you believe you are doing well, you are asleep. The moment you see, with pain in your chest, that you get lost every few seconds is the first moment of radical honesty. This pain is not an error, it is a sign, it is the real beginning. In the Hermetic texts, ignorance is described as forgetfulness of origin. And here is the point no one talks about. You did not forget God, you forgot the state of presence. God in Hermeticism is not an external belief, it is the principle of unified consciousness. Every time you get lost in thought, you move away from that principle. Every time you return to silent observation, you move closer. This is mechanical, not mystical, and precisely because it is mechanical, it is ignored. Another very rare teaching, the spiritual ego is not defeated by truth, but by the silent repetition of presence. You can understand everything intellectually and remain enslaved. The ego survives on understanding, it dies from lack of emotional nourishment. And its nourishment is your identification. When you observe without identifying, again and again it weakens. Not in a day, not in one experience, but through constant erosion. This demands brutal patience. Hermeticism also reveals something deeply uncomfortable. Most people confuse emotional intensity with spiritual depth. You feel something strong and think you touch truth. Hermes is merciless here. Emotion is movement of the lower soul. The Nous is silent. If you are always seeking to feel something, you are fleeing the exact point where truth appears. And that point is dry, simple, almost dull to those who live on stimulation. There is also a teaching almost never mentioned. Real awakening makes you more vulnerable, not more protected. You lose layers, you lose automatic defenses, you lose ready-made answers. And this is frightening because the world does not become easier. You simply stop hiding. Hermeticism does not create spiritual armor. It removes the illusory ones. And being exposed hurts, but it is the only position from which truth can be seen. Another rare point, the human being prefers to explain his pain rather than feel it consciously. You analyze, justify, rationalize, all to avoid staying present in discomfort. Hermes points out that while you explain, you do not see. And while you do not see, you are not liberated. The work is to feel and observe at the same time without story. This is almost unbearable at first. That is why it is avoided. But it is exactly what dissolves the prison. Hermeticism also shows implicitly that psychological time is the great anesthetic. You live remembering the past or anticipating the future in order not to be here. This constant movement creates the sense of continuity of the self. When you interrupt this and remain in the now, identity trembles. And this trembling is the clearest sign that you touch the right point. If there is no tremor, there is no real work. Here is a teaching almost no one accepts. Awakening does not give you immediate meaning for life. It first removes false meanings. You feel empty, without direction, almost lost. And then you think you made a mistake. You did not. You simply stopped deceiving yourself. True meaning appears only after fabricated meanings collapse. Whoever cannot endure this phase runs back to any belief that fills the hole. Another brutally honest point. Hermeticism does not want you to become better, it wants you to become true. And the initial truth is that you do not control your mind, you do not choose your states, and you live a large part of the time absent. Accepting this without self-hatred is one of the hardest trials, because the ego prefers to hate itself than to disappear. Hatred still preserves identity. Silent observation dissolves it. And here is perhaps the most secret teaching of all, because it cannot be sold, promised, or dramatized. Awakening happens when you remain conscious even when nothing happens. No emotion, no vision, no answer, just here, just seeing. This state feels empty to those who seek experience, but it is fullness to those who recognize the real. Now let this question pass through you without seeking an immediate answer. At what moment in your day do you always disappear without noticing? What exactly in you loses strength when you remain present? And if the true Hermetic work is not to advance, but not to be absent in the next instant, are you willing to sustain this naked lucidity? Or do you still need more words to postpone the moment when there is nowhere left to hide? Now, we arrive at the point almost no one sustains. Because here, Hermeticism reveals something that does not soothe, it disarms. There is an ancient teaching, rarely exposed directly, that runs silently through the treatises. The human being is not asleep due to lack of light, but due to excess of identification. You identify with what you think, with what you feel, with how you react, and you call this life. Awakening begins when this identification hurts more than the pain it produces, when you grow tired of being dragged. There is a brutally true secret. Consciousness does not grow when you understand, it grows when you endure, not moving. The impulse to act, respond, explain, justify, all of this is escape. The Hermetic texts do not say do more, they say see more. And seeing more means staying. Staying when emotion tightens, staying when emptiness appears, staying when thought screams. Most flee exactly here because staying dismantles the ego's last refuge, movement. Another very rare teaching. Awakening does not give you an identity, it pulls the ground out from under identity. You begin to see that what you called me is a set of reflexes, and this does not bring immediate relief, it brings vertigo. Vertigo because you realize you lived defending something that was never solid. The texts call this disturbance of the soul before regeneration. It is the price of honesty. There is something almost never said clearly. Inner silence does not come when the mind stops. The mind stops when silence is accepted. You try to quiet thoughts and become frustrated. The real teaching is different. Accept the silence behind the noise. The noise continues, but you do not go with it. This inner shift is microscopic and decisive. It is here that presence begins to stabilize, not as a pleasant state, but as an axis. Another devastating point, the suffering that imprisons you most is not what you feel, but what you avoid feeling consciously. You avoid boredom, insecurity, the sense of insignificance, and every avoidance creates an invisible prison. Hermeticism does not ask for courage to face external monsters. It asks for courage not to anesthetize yourself in the face of what arises inside. This is rarer than any ritual. There is a teaching that is technical and emotional at the same time. The time of awakening is measured in seconds of sustained presence. Not in years of study, not in intense experiences, in seconds. 1 second in which you do not get lost, 2 seconds, 5. Each of these seconds corrodes centuries of automatism, but you devalue this because it does not seem grand. The ego wants fireworks, Hermeticism wants duration. Another secret no one likes to hear. Awakening does not solve your life, it exposes how you live. Relationships become more naked, work becomes clearer, conflicts become more evident, not because they worsened, but because you stopped hiding. And this generates a strong desire to turn back, to seek spiritual comfort, to distract yourself. Recognizing this desire without following it is a silent victory. There is still something profoundly uncomfortable. True progress is invisible. No one notices it, often not even you, because it does not happen at the level of story, but at the level of the reaction that did not occur, the word that was not spoken, the impulse that was seen and dissolved. This creates no narrative, it gives no identity. That is why it is despised. Yet it is exactly this that shifts the axis of life. Another very rare teaching, awakening requires losing the haste to arrive. Haste is the ego's last defense. While you are in a hurry, you are not here. Hermeticism cuts haste by demanding full attention in the ordinary instant, and this deeply irritates the conditioned mind because it lives on anticipation. When anticipation collapses, identity trembles. Now comes the most sensitive point of all. There is a part of you that prefers to suffer rather than disappear. It feeds on drama, on seeking, on the feeling of being on the path. Seeing this hurts more than any ignorance. Because you realize the obstacle is not outside, not in the past, not in the world. It is the attachment to continuing to be someone. And awakening begins exactly when you stop protecting that attachment. Hermeticism does not promise comfortable liberation. It points to a naked freedom, being conscious without leaning on anything, neither certainty nor sensation nor identity. This state feels empty to those who seek experiences, but it is fullness to those who are tired of lying to themselves. It is simple, it is harsh, it is silent. And now let this question remain without a quick answer, without explanation, without escape. At what moment do you always choose to get lost because being present hurts too much? What exactly in you ceases to exist when you do not react? And if the most secret teaching of all is simply this, not to be absent in the next second, are you willing to sustain this raw lucidity? Or do you still prefer more layers, more words, more seeking, to avoid the instant in which there is no longer a character to hold on to? Now you enter the territory where Hermeticism ceases to be teaching and becomes a cruel mirror, because here something emerges that almost no one can bear to admit. You are not merely asleep, you defend sleep. There is a hidden gain in remaining unconscious. The gain of not fully feeling. The gain of not assuming responsibility for the instant. The gain of continuing to be carried along. The Hermetic texts are clear in pointing out that the human being clings to passions because they absolve him from presence. While you react, you do not need to be here. There is a very rare teaching, yet completely faithful to the Hermetic spirit. Real awakening begins when you realize that you do not want to awaken all the time. There are parts of you that want silence and parts that want noise, parts that want truth and parts that want anesthesia. The common error is to deny this. Hermeticism does not tell you to deny it. It tells you to see it, to see the division without trying to unify it by force. Unity is born when the division is seen in its entirety. There is a point almost never stated clearly. The greatest addiction of the human being is not pleasure, it is distraction. You distract yourself to avoid feeling, you distract yourself to avoid seeing, you distract yourself to avoid being. The Corpus Hermeticum treats this as dispersion of the soul. And here's the practical secret. Each time you resist the impulse to distract yourself and remain conscious, you recover a fragment of the soul, not as metaphor, as lived fact. Another brutally true teaching. Awakening does not happen when you feel good. It happens when you are uncomfortable and do not flee. Discomfort is the alarm. The moment when something tightens in the chest, accelerates the mind, creates tension in the body. That is the laboratory. If you flee, you reinforce sleep. If you stay, without drama, without narrative, something begins to reorganize itself on its own. This is not modern psychology. This is real inner alchemy. There is something almost no one speaks of because it destroys the fantasy of spiritual progress. You do not become more conscious. You lose unconsciousness for brief moments, and these moments are small, fragile, and they demand constant vigilance. The ego hates this because it wants a definitive conquest. Hermeticism responds with a blade. There is no final state while you are alive. There is only renewed presence or renewed forgetfulness. There is also a very rare and deeply emotional teaching. Inner silence does not immediately bring relief. It brings exposure. Without noise, you feel what was muffled. Old sadness, nameless fear, raw emptiness. And here many conclude they have failed. They have not. They have simply stopped anesthetizing themselves. Hermeticism never promised initial comfort. It promised truth. And truth at first weighs heavily. Another point almost always concealed. Awakening does not improve your image of yourself. It dismantles it. You begin to see that your opinions are not as solid as you thought, that your certainties are inherited, that your reactions are predictable. This wounds the deepest pride, and that is why so many turn Hermeticism into aesthetics, language, identity, because living the truth is harder than representing it. There is also a technical and devastating teaching. Presence is not continuous because the mind creates micro-escapes, small inner comments, small judgments, small anticipations. Each micro-escape seems harmless. Together they build sleep. The real work is to notice these micro-escapes at the instant they arise and not follow them. This requires an almost brutal honesty with yourself. Without it, everything becomes discourse. There is something even deeper and rarely spoken. Awakening requires accepting that you do not know how to live consciously. You do not know how to stay, you do not know how to feel, you do not know how to be. This admission hurts because it dismantles the image of the advanced seeker. But until you admit it, you cannot learn. Hermeticism always begins with assumed ignorance. Only the conscious ignoramus can regenerate. Another very rare teaching. The true Hermetic sacrifice is not giving up external things, it is giving up the right to get lost without noticing. This changes everything. Because now every reaction seen creates responsibility. Every escape perceived creates choice. And this is tiring. Yes, it is tiring. The ego calls this weight. Hermeticism calls it nascent freedom. And here is perhaps the most painful point of all. No one can do this work for you, and no one can see where you get lost except you. There is no teacher who can replace your attention. There is no text that can sustain presence in your place. The path is solitary not because of isolation, but because consciousness is non-transferable. Now let this question pass through you without seeking a quick answer, without spiritualizing, without fleeing. In which moments do you choose distraction, knowing deep down that you are absenting yourself? What exactly do you avoid feeling when you get lost? And if the most secret teaching of all is not an ancient text, but the raw decision not to disappear in the next impulse, are you willing to sustain this silent lucidity? Or do you still prefer to keep seeking something deeper, so as not to face the exact point where everything is decided now? There is still something profoundly uncomfortable. True progress is invisible. No one notices it. Often, not even you. Because it does not happen at the level of story, but at the level of the reaction that did not occur, the word that was not spoken, the impulse that was seen and dissolved. This creates no narrative, it gives no identity. That is why it is despised. Yet it is exactly this that shifts the axis of life. Another very rare teaching. Awakening requires losing the haste to arrive. Haste is the ego's last defense. While you are in a hurry, you are not here. Hermeticism cuts haste by demanding full attention in the ordinary instant. And this deeply irritates the conditioned mind because it lives on anticipation. When anticipation collapses, identity trembles. Now comes the most sensitive point of all. There is a part of you that prefers to suffer rather than disappear. It feeds on drama, on seeking, on the feeling of being on the path. Seeing this hurts more than any ignorance, because you realize the obstacle is not outside, not in the past, not in the world. It is the attachment to continuing to be someone. And awakening begins exactly when you stop protecting that attachment. Hermeticism does not promise comfortable liberation. It points to a naked freedom, being conscious without leaning on anything, neither certainty, nor sensation, nor identity. This state feels empty to those who seek experiences, but it is fullness to those who are tired of lying to themselves. It is simple, it is harsh, it is silent. And now let this question remain without a quick answer, without explanation, without escape. At what moment do you always choose to get lost because being present hurts too much? What exactly in you ceases to exist when you do not react? And if the most secret teaching of all is simply this, not to be absent in the next second, are you willing to sustain this raw lucidity? Or do you still prefer more layers, more words, more seeking, to avoid the instant in which there is no longer a character to hold on to? Now you enter the territory where Hermeticism ceases to be teaching and becomes a cruel mirror, because here something emerges that almost no one can bear to admit. You are not merely asleep, you defend sleep. There is a hidden gain in remaining unconscious, the gain of not fully feeling. the gain of not assuming responsibility for the instant, the gain of continuing to be carried along. The Hermetic texts are clear in pointing out that the human being clings to passions because they absolve him from presence. While you react, you do not need to be here. There is a very rare teaching, yet completely faithful to the Hermetic spirit. Real awakening begins when you realize that you do not want to awaken all the time. There are parts of you that want silence and parts that want noise, parts that want truth and parts that want anesthesia. The common error is to deny this. Hermeticism does not tell you to deny it. It tells you to see it, to see the division without trying to unify it by force. Unity is born when the division is seen in its entirety. There is a point almost never stated clearly. The greatest addiction of the human being is not pleasure, it is distraction. You distract yourself to avoid feeling, you distract yourself to avoid seeing, you distract yourself to avoid being. The Corpus Hermeticum treats this as dispersion of the soul. And here's the practical secret. Each time you resist the impulse to distract yourself and remain conscious, you recover a fragment of the soul, not as metaphor, as lived fact. Another brutally true teaching. Awakening does not happen when you feel good. It happens when you are uncomfortable and do not flee. Discomfort is the alarm. The moment when something tightens in the chest, accelerates the mind, creates tension in the body. That is the laboratory. If you flee, you reinforce sleep. If you stay, without drama, without narrative, something begins to reorganize itself on its own. This is not modern psychology. This is real inner alchemy. There is something almost no one speaks of because it destroys the fantasy of spiritual progress. You do not become more conscious. You lose unconsciousness for brief moments, and these moments are small, fragile, and they demand constant vigilance. The ego hates this because it wants a definitive conquest. Hermeticism responds with a blade. There is no final state while you are alive. There is only renewed presence or renewed forgetfulness. There is also a very rare and deeply emotional teaching. Inner silence does not immediately bring relief. It brings exposure. Without noise, you feel what was muffled. Old sadness, nameless fear, raw emptiness. And here many conclude they have failed. They have not. They have simply stopped anesthetizing themselves. Hermeticism never promised initial comfort. It promised truth. And truth at first weighs heavily. Another point almost always concealed. Awakening does not improve your image of yourself. It dismantles it. You begin to see that your opinions are not as solid as you thought, that your certainties are inherited, that your reactions are predictable. This wounds the deepest pride, and that is why so many turn Hermeticism into aesthetics, language, identity, because living the truth is harder than representing it. There is also a technical and devastating teaching. Presence is not continuous because the mind creates micro-escapes, small inner comments, small judgments, small anticipations. Each micro-escape seems harmless. Together they build sleep. The real work is to notice these micro-escapes at the instant they arise and not follow them. This requires an almost brutal honesty with yourself. Without it, everything becomes discourse. There is something even deeper and rarely spoken. Awakening requires accepting that you do not know how to live consciously. You do not know how to stay, you do not know how to feel, you do not know how to be. This admission hurts because it dismantles the image of the advanced seeker. But until you admit it, you cannot learn. Hermeticism always begins with assumed ignorance. Only the conscious ignoramus can regenerate. Another very rare teaching. The true Hermetic sacrifice is not giving up external things, it is giving up the right to get lost without noticing. This changes everything. Because now every reaction seen creates responsibility. Every escape perceived creates choice. And this is tiring. Yes, it is tiring. The ego calls this weight. Hermeticism calls it nascent freedom. And here is perhaps the most painful point of all. No one can do this work for you, and no one can see where you get lost except you. There is no teacher who can replace your attention. There is no text that can sustain presence in your place. The path is solitary not because of isolation, but because consciousness is non-transferable. Now let this question pass through you without seeking a quick answer, without spiritualizing, without fleeing. In which moments do you choose distraction, knowing deep down that you are absenting yourself? What exactly do you avoid feeling when you get lost? And if the most secret teaching of all is not an ancient text, but the raw decision not to disappear in the next impulse, are you willing to sustain this silent lucidity? Or do you still prefer to keep seeking something deeper, so as not to face the exact point where everything is decided now? You do not awaken by reading more books. You awaken when, in the middle of the day, in the middle of anger, in the middle of anxiety, you notice that something in you observes all of this without being affected. The Corpus Hermeticum points to this when it speaks of the Nous, the divine intellectual principle, not as logical reasoning but as lucid perception. Nous is not thinking better, it is seeing. And you do not see because you live reacting. Reacting is the opposite of awakening. The The Kybalion summarizes laws that were already implicit in the ancient Hermetic texts. When it speaks of mentalism, it is not saying that everything is imagination. It is saying that the reality you experience passes first through your conditioned mind, and your mind today is a reflection of the collective, of history, of fear, of the search for validation. As long as you do not observe this in daily life, in traffic, at work, in conversations, you remain a prisoner of the same mechanism. Awakening begins when you see this mechanism operating in real time without justifying it, without romanticizing it. The law of correspondence, as above, so below, was never about cheap magic. It points out that the same chaos that exists outside you exists inside you. If your life is confused, your mind is confused. If your life is reactive, your mind is reactive, you want to change the world, but you cannot remain conscious of what you feel for 5 minutes without fleeing. Hermes is direct. One who does not govern the inner governs nothing, and to govern is not to control by force. It is to know. Hermetic practice does not happen first in external rituals. It happens when you begin to remember yourself while you live, when you eat and know that you are eating, when you listen and know that you are listening, when emotion rises and you do not become the emotion. This is real alchemy. This is transforming lead into gold within ordinary life. The Corpus Hermeticum speaks of regeneration as a process of dying to old identification and being born into more lucid consciousness. This hurts. That is why almost no one does it. Kabbalah, when it speaks of the ascent of consciousness through levels of reality, is not describing a mystical journey out of the body. It is describing degrees of perception. You live in the densest levels when you only react, desire, fear. You ascend when you begin to perceive your own reaction before acting. Each instant of real attention is a step. Each instant of forgetfulness is a fall. There is no definitive awakening while you are alive. There is constant work. Hermes makes it clear, ignorance is the greatest evil. And ignorance here is forgetting yourself. You forget the one who observes. You get lost in the character. And then you call that life. Hermetic awakening is remembering again and again until this remembrance becomes stronger than the habit of sleeping. It is not beautiful. It is not light. It is brutally honest. You want signs, visions, external confirmations. Hermeticism cuts this at the root. The sign is your capacity to be present now. If you cannot, that is the diagnosis. And if you can for a few seconds, that is the real beginning. There is no other door. There is no other shortcut. Everything that does not pass through this is spiritual distraction. Now tell me, with brutal honesty, in how many moments of your day are you truly here, whole, conscious, without getting lost in thought? What in you resists when you realize that you live on automatic pilot? And what if true awakening is not achieving something new, but losing everything you insist on calling me? Subscribe to the channel if you do not want stage spirituality, but real confrontation with the sleep of consciousness. Turn on notifications because this channel does not deliver comfort. It delivers continuous lucidity. Comment only if you are honest. At what moment of your day do you most lose yourself without noticing? Share this video only with those you know are already tired of pretending they are awake. Return, not to watch, but to test whether you can remain present longer than before. If you have reached this point, something in you no longer wants to sleep in the same way. And this is not merit, not evolution, not spiritual status. It is discomfort. Hermeticism has always made it clear that real awakening does not begin when you understand, but when you can no longer deceive yourself without noticing. From here on, there is no comfortable return. Either you observe when you get lost, or you go back to getting lost while pretending you did not see. Nothing that was said here is meant to give you an identity, nor to place you above anyone else. On the contrary, it is meant to pull the ground out from under you, dismantle the fantasy of control, tear away the spiritual character you learned to protect. Thoth never promised easy light. Hermes never promised emotional peace. What was promised and demanded was lucidity. And lucidity is expensive because it requires you to be present exactly where you always ran away. Now the question is no longer what is awakening. The question is, in which instant will you remember yourself when you would normally disappear? In the next automatic thought, in the next emotion that drags you away, in the next impulse toward distraction? The real work begins outside this video, in the next second and the next and the next. If you want to keep walking this path without anesthesia, without spiritual fantasy, and without comfortable lies, then you already know what to do, not with words, but with presence. And now, without closing anything, without final conclusion, the portal remains open. Will you remember yourself? Or will you forget once again, believing that later will solve it?